Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 28 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. Today's episode is titled Iron, Diabetes, and Joint Health, an unsuspecting culprit in the health of our connective tissues. We're going to talk a little bit more about how iron can affect your joints, and we'll talk more about the rates of diabetic neuropathy, diabetic arthropathy, in diabetics, why that can be, and some of the research supporting how that happens. Now, if we have not met, my name is Bowie. I have had type 1 diabetes for over 22 years. I am healing naturally. I'm focusing on everything under the sun that can be used to heal organ systems. Talked a lot about the liver. I've talked about mitochondria, joints, parasites, bacteria, and in collecting all of this research, I have started to share it. I started my TikTok channel about a little over a year ago now, and ever since then, it has just blossomed into this beautiful kind of community research project. So if you don't already follow me on TikTok, please do there, and then subscribe here, talking all things type 1 and type 2, basically the diabetic condition in general, and all of the things that the mainstream medicine, your endocrinologist, what have you, aren't talking about. So we have people who have had it for 30 years, had people who have had it for 6 months. We're talking about things that are not getting covered in the mainstream. So when it comes to joint pain, why do diabetics have it so much, right? So those with diabetes are twice as likely to develop arthritis, and half of all diabetics today experience neuropathy. Now, why, right? We're more likely to experience high blood pressure, arterial disease, chronic joint pain, all of those things that go along with bone health, joint health, like pain in movement. And it's really kind of a tough feedback loop, because when you think about someone having diabetes, you say, well, movement is one of the best medicines in terms of improving the diabetic condition, and untreated diabetes is working against you in making that harder and harder. You hear plenty of times that diabetics with neuropathy in their feet so bad that they, it hurts to walk, but if you can't walk, then it's tough to heal your diabetes. So it's just, it's something that needs to be addressed. So let's talk a little bit more about why that's happening. So in untreated diabetes, chronically high blood sugar negatively affects the circulation of blood, oxygen, and nutrients. Okay. The glucose that is circulating in the blood at extremely high levels is big and sticky molecule. We'll talk about that in the next slide as well, but it basically slows the blood down in those tight capillary beds where nutrients, oxygen are being exchanged. So this goes for nerve cells, this goes for joints, hands, toes, feet, what have you. When that glucose starts to clog things up and stiffen things, that missing oxygen leads to nerve cell die-off, and those capillaries and arteries begin to stiffen, calcify, and when that happens, they aren't able to get the nutrients, and they begin to die off. So, not to mention, diabetes is associated with chronic low to medium grade inflammation, like that experienced in arthritis. So, the diabetic state itself is born of inflammation. So, when we think of a sports injury, let's say, like, he hurt his knee, it's like really inflamed. That the inflammation itself is an impedance to effective movement and tissue health. All right, and then icing on the cake is that we're living a lifestyle, even if we are considered quote unquote healthy, that is becoming more and more sedentary. Combined with our poor dietary habits, which we'll talk more about in terms of getting our iron load And all of these things combined just make for an inflammatory mess that just exacerbates these conditions and makes everything a little bit tougher to work with. So like I mentioned before, those glucose molecules are too big when in abundance in those little capillary beds, right? So when you think of someone struggling with diabetes, what are the first things to go? Usually their fingers or their feet, their eyes. Macular degeneration is a big one, or what is it? Diabetic. Um, it's not glaucoma. Is it glaucoma? Maybe it is glaucoma. Where the eyes start to break down because the capillaries in the eyes are extremely fine, and they're so fine that when the blood is loaded with all of these sticky sugar molecules, it tends to clog things up and prevent adequate blood flow, and so the cells start to die off. The same is true for joints, right? And classically, in all of the papers that I've read about it, the feet, the hips, and the wrists, they talk a lot about carpal tunnel for people with diabetes as well, and iron overload. Those are classically the first joints that are experiencing issues. So, if you're just kind of here for the short term, and you're like, okay, so what? What is, like, how are you supposed to deal with it? I just talked all about how chronically high blood sugars lead to all these issues. What is the best defense? Not having chronically high blood sugars. So the best defense against diabetic neuropathy and arthropathy is a well-controlled blood sugar. I can't make it any simpler, right? I get a lot of people online asking me, "Oh, what am I going to do about this neuropathy? Oh, it hurts." And I'll say, "What are you doing to manage your blood sugar?" And they'll say, "I'm not." And I say, that's it. That's it. Whatever means necessary, whether it be exercise, diet, hydration, altering your food choices. You can't address the neuropathy and not control your blood sugar. There's no other way around that. So that's that for the kind of blood sugar hyperglycemia aspect of the joint pain. What I'm really, really fascinated with now is the effect of our iron load. So this is the Tin Man. I should have labeled him the Iron Man, but the idea that diabetics need our joints greased, much like the Tin Man did in The Wizard of Oz. So, by the statistics, just looking at those with clinical iron overload or hemochromatosis, hemochromatic patients let me reword that. 50% of those diagnosed with hemochromatosis get diabetes. And when it comes to those with hemochromatosis experiencing bone abnormalities, north of a quarter, anywhere from a quarter to a third of those with hemochromatosis experience osteoarthritis, and anywhere from 40 to 80% of those with hemochromatosis are experiencing osteopenia, right? Osteoarthritis and osteopenia are both differing degrees of bone degeneration and loss of bone mineral density. And I've got some citations there for papers where that information came from. Now, when you compare, look at iron metabolism and its role in bone health, just like everywhere else. So we've talked about it in the liver, we've talked about it in the pancreas, the mitochondria of any cell type. Iron is important, right? It plays an important role in the proper formation of bone. And because of that important role, if something is awry, things do not go well, right? So this has been shown in both iron deficiency as well as in iron overload conditions. Bone health suffers, right? So from remineralization, so the density of the bone itself and how strong the bone is, as well as its ability to regenerate. Those are all affected by a couple different means of which we'll talk about. So if you just look over at this picture on the right, this is from a paper we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But this particular case is talking more on the overloaded side of iron as opposed to the iron deficient. But it's just a quick graphic showing that on this side, which is responsible for bone destruction, and this side, which is responsible for bone formation, iron overload aids in the destruction of bone and slows the formation of bone. Right? So this is a recipe for poor bone mineral density. And we'll talk a little bit more about why. So let's get the verbiage squared away for this. So bone is made up of two main types of cells, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. The one with a B, the osteoblast in the green, that is growth. We are growing bone. That is a good thing. But bones are a living organism. Usually when the layperson thinks of a skeleton, they just think, oh, it's like a stiff bone that, all of our body is kind of built on. No, the bones are living. I think I read before that the skeleton completely regenerates once every 10 years. So bones live, right? They bleed. Bone marrow is incredibly rich in a lot of great nutrients that help grow bone. So osteoblasts are responsible for growth. Osteoclasts with a C are responsible for the degeneration of bone. Okay, so osteoblasts make new bone. Osteoclasts are the ones that break down the old, the damaged, they heal broken bones and things like that to make room for osteoblast growth. So this is the paper that I took the graphic from a couple slides ago, but it is talking about how iron impacts bone loss. So it's taking a look from the perspective of both osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So focusing here on osteoclasts, which is the breaking down of bone, number one says, accumulating evidence suggests that iron facilitate osteoclast differentiation, activation, and bone resorption. Bone resorption is basically like dissolving bone, taking away the minerals so that it can be broken down effectively. So there we go. Iron facilitates the creation of osteoclasts and the breakdown of bone. Number two, osteoclasts have a high energy demand, which is fueled by a lot of mitochondria. So another thing to remember, osteoclasts are mitochondria rich. I believe episode 27, our last episode, was on iron in the mitochondria. Mitochondria are extremely iron rich, right? So because osteoclasts require a lot of energy to break down bone, they also have a lot of mitochondria. A lot of mitochondria have a lot of iron. A lot of clasts need a lot of iron. And then number three, basically continuing what I was just talking about, mitochondrial biogenesis, of which osteoclasts have a lot of, is an iron-dependent process because the proteins of the chain responsible for making the mitochondria are iron-containing proteins. So number four, iron catalyzes the formation of reactive oxygen species, of which we know, and this effect was found to be critical in iron-mediated promotion of osteoclast differentiation. So iron is extremely volatile. It's a pro-oxidant. It makes ROS like nobody's business. Google the Fenton reaction if you're unfamiliar with this. I've talked about this a lot in the podcast before as well. But so iron itself, wherever it's going, it's usually creating ROS as waste. This ROS is creating an environment that is promoting the creation of osteoclasts, which is breaking down bone, right? So you can kind of see iron is playing a role in bone being broken down, right? So osteoclasts are mitochondria rich. If they're mitochondria rich, that means they're iron rich. And if they're iron rich, that means they're ROS rich, which means inflammation, or at least having to get rid of waste effectively. And if you have a lot of waste with a lot of iron also, that's a recipe for inflammatory disaster. Now, those with iron overload experience increased osteoclast formation, right? Because we just mentioned that osteoclasts thrive in a high iron state. The more osteoclasts there are, the greater the iron demand, the more ROS, the more the bone breaks down. Everybody kind of get hold of that. So when you talk about bones from the beginning, from creation, right? Bone cells are derived from stem cells, usually in the bone marrow. Now, with those stem cells, when they form in an iron-rich environment, we're going to talk about this in a second when we touch on osteoblasts, but when stem cells are in an iron-rich environment, the stem cells, which have the ability to differentiate into whatever it is that are needed, they tend to form more osteoclasts than they do osteoblasts, right? So if you are breaking down 3 bone cells for every one that you're growing, that bone is going to degenerate, right? So stem cells in an iron-rich environment, more osteoclasts. This is going to lead to more ROS, more bone resorption, less stable extracellular matrix, which is basically the structural integrity of the bone, and therefore your bone mineral density decreases. Okay, so we get that an iron overloaded state leads to iron osteoclasts being boosted. What about osteoblasts? Is it affecting the growth of new bone cells as well? And it turns out that it might be. All right, so osteoblasts are made from stem cells in the bone marrow. Increased iron content in the stem cells lead to an affected number of stem cells, right? So it's definitely messing with the volume of stem cells being created. And for those stem cells that are being created, they have a diminished ability to differentiate into new bone cells. So it's affecting the volume of raw materials to build, and it's preventing the raw materials from being made into something that is going to help bones grow, which is bad news if you're someone looking to keep your bones dense and strong. So this is just one paragraph from that Genet paper, and I'm basically gonna focus on the underlined phrases here. So iron selectively inhibits osteogenic differentiation of BMSCs, is bone marrow stem cells. So iron selectively inhibits osteogenic, which is bone forming, differentiation of stem cells. Okay. Of note, to complete that sentence, without influencing adipogenic, which is fat forming, and then chondrogenic, which is cartilage forming. Okay, so it's directly affecting bone, not affecting the creation of fat or the creation of cartilage. So there are other studies originated from the field of stem cell-based therapeutics that also support the idea of inhibitory nature of iron on the osteogenic differentiation of MSCs. MSCs stand for mesenchymal stem cell. Mesenchymal just refers to the type of tissue that these stem cells are derived from. Mesenchymal stem cells can come from bone marrow, they can come from blood, but essentially you see SC, it's just standing for stem cells. So iron has shown across numerous types of stem cells its ability to prevent it from forming bone cells. And there's another paper I'm going to talk about both of these, both the Below as well as the Chang 2012 paper. Chang 2012 talked about how more iron in the cell, in stem cells rather, impairs their ability to create bone. So basically you have multiple sources saying stem cells don't do as well with too much iron. And these are the two papers that I was talking about, the Below as well as the Chang paper. So iron overload inhibits osteogenic commitment and differentiation of mesenchymal stem cells, which are the MSCs, via the induction of ferritin. Okay, so ferritin is having a role here in the proliferation of stem cells. And then this very fancy name, amine surface modified supraparamagnetic iron oxide nanoparticles interfere with differentiation of human MSCs. So, just a brief summary. I don't expect everyone to dive right into these, but Below talks about how increased iron and or increased ferritin led to decreased stem cell capabilities. So like we were talking about before, the more iron is present, the more ferritin is present, those stem cells do not become everything that they possibly could. And I'll make a point a little bit later about the role of ferritin in it all. I know sometimes when people hear the iron overload talk, they get really caught up on serum ferritin and being iron deficient anemic. So hang on to that for a second. But just to say, the more iron there is, or the more ferritin there is in circulation, it's affecting the abilities of the stem cells. An important note from Below as well, that bone, right, the decreased ability of the stem cells to create bone, the iron did not affect the stem cells' ability to create cartilage or create fat, which is interesting, especially when you think about the ties between diabetes and extra fat, obesity. Cheng et al. So remember the very complicated title, right? That amine surface modified supraparamagnetic iron oxide nanoparticles. It's like, oh my goodness. So basically, those nanoparticles are labeling features, like iron molecules that scientists have attached to stem cells in research to visualize where they're going, right? So they're either bioluminescent or they're able to be tracked by MRI. So basically the magnetism of iron is being attached to these stem cells so that scientists, when they use these stem cells, can see where they go in different tissues. But what they weren't sure about was the effect that attaching this iron to the stem cell had on the stem cell's health. And so this paper was looking at how attaching this iron oxide molecule to the stem cells increased the growth rate of the stem cell. So you may be thinking, okay, that's not bad. More stem cells, that's good. But it decreased the ability to form bone, which is not good for anybody concerned with regenerating bone. It formed fat instead of forming bone, right? So stem cells with this particular iron particle attached to it prioritize becoming fat instead of becoming bone. Again, not a good thing when you think about how these stem cells are needed to regenerate more bone. Okay, so coming to a close here, but more things to think about. I mentioned before about the tie between iron, ferritin, and the negative effects on stem cell capabilities. Now, usually when I talk about iron overload, people tend to go back to, oh, well, ferritin means iron If you are anemic or have been diagnosed anemic, it's because you have low serum ferritin, which means you have low iron. Now, I always want to reiterate that ferritin is an intracellular protein. It is supposed to be inside the cell. No one has a very good answer as to why it is in the serum. So those diagnosed as iron deficient are commonly only basing that on the status of their serum ferritin. Because there was a paper in the 70s that said if you have iron overload, you have high serum ferritin. If you're iron deficient, you have low serum ferritin, and anywhere in between that, you're normal. But that the serum ferritin and your total body iron load can be very misleading. It is not one-to-one like most people think. Like, oh, if my serum ferritin is low, I don't have enough iron in my body. Not necessarily true. Depends on your state of chronic inflammation. It depends on the status of the minerals needed to properly utilize the iron that you do have stored in your tissues, not in your serum. So we too quickly dismiss the possibility of iron overload independent of our serum ferritin, right? We just kind of take serum ferritin at face value for our body's iron load, and that's not the case, right? I have come to this by comparing the symptoms of iron overload to what we're experiencing as a society, and it's undeniable, the connections, right? I mentioned before, one of the first few slides talking about how 50% of hemochromatosis patients have diabetes. Anywhere from a quarter to 80% of them are experiencing some sort of arthritis, osteopenia, osteoarthritis. So when you line those things up, it's pretty undeniable to say maybe our measure for iron isn't correct, or maybe it isn't quite as clear as we thought it once was. So that's how I've come to this, and just an interesting take on it all. I'm going to take that iron stem cell connection a little bit further in one of my future episodes. I want to see what effect iron has on any stem cell, whether it's a pluripotent or bone marrow or mesenchymal, like wherever it's coming from. How does iron affect the ability for stem cells to be able to differentiate and become different things, right? Because as a diabetic, we have to be, or as someone with diabetes, we have to be interested in stem cells, right? That's one of the prime therapies. Now, if people are iron overloaded, that could adversely affect how well those stem cells take hold and how well they become what we need them to become. Okay. So thank you so much for being here. Again, I wrote an entire book documenting the ties between iron overload, inflammation, and diabetes. It's called An Ironclad Cause, Solving Diabetes and More. It's available via the link in the video description. I've also got nutrition guides there, supplement guides. I just published the Iron Out Protocol, which is how I have been targeting getting rid of the extra iron in my tissues. That's all available via the link in my description as well. So this is episode 28 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. I'm your host, Bowie Madison. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.